Breakaway interviews, please let me know and I can help you after that. And so they'll be coming down in just a minute. Thank you.
Live.
Recording in progress. Recording stopped.
Yeah. Yes.
Just do this.
It's inside really. It's in the security.
Can you copy those too?
I'm sorry.
Stay on. People are in.
I think you were on her computers. So I'll have to be right next to him to do it. I'm not.
On February 27, 2023, a white passenger van
Recording in progress.
approached the port of entry that separates El Paso from the city of Juarez. And the individuals who were driving that van were stopped by Mexico border inspection officials, who became concerned that something wasn't right. And so they ordered the van to be returned to the port of entry on the American side. And when the occupants of the van came into contact with Border Patrol agents, they were at first reluctant to have those agents look inside the vehicle. But after a brief investigation, they actually allowed those agents to look inside. And when these federal agents opened up the back of the van, they discovered a 38-year-old woman by the name of Mary Morello, who had been in the care of Angelita Chacon and her girlfriend, Patricia Hurtado. And what those two individuals explained to Border Patrol agents is that they were taking Mary Morello into Mexico to receive care and treatment for wounds and injuries that she had suffered. When they tried to talk to Mary, she was unresponsive. She was nonverbal. The only thing she could manage to do in the presence of these officers was cry. And they knew something was wrong. They knew that she looked and appeared in very serious medical distress. She was dehydrated. It later turned out that she had been given Benadryl and was in fact drugged. They immediately called first responders, and first responders recognized the condition that Mary was in and transported her immediately to the El Paso Medical Center. She stayed in the El Paso Medical Center after suffering a cardiac arrest, after being diagnosed with septic shock for several months, until she passed away on April 7th of this year. And since that time, agencies led by the New Mexico Attorney General's Office, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the field offices here in Albuquerque and in El Paso, our partners at the Rio Rancho Police Department and the New Mexico State Police have been engaged in a wide-ranging investigation into the events that led up to Mary Morello's appearance at the border. In my nearly 20 years as prosecutor, I can tell you without question that the injuries that Mary endured, that the harm that was inflicted upon her was nothing short of torture. She had multiple bed sores and pressure wounds that were so severe there was even exposed bone. There were marks and abrasions and ligature marks that indicated that she had, in fact, been restrained at some point. And when investigators started to dig deeper into this story, what they discovered was that Mary had been in the care of Angelita Chacon at a residence in Rio Rancho. And Ms. Chacon was being paid nearly $5,000 a month by the state of New Mexico through the DD waiver program to care for her in a private residential setting. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the DD waiver program, it's actually a program that allows for adults and children with disabilities to be cared for in the community rather than in institutions. And when it is well executed, it is something that provides for people with disabilities to be better integrated into our communities and cared for by loved ones and trained professionals. But I think Mary's case highlights the need not only for law enforcement engagement, oversight, to make sure that crimes and criminal conduct, which we'll outline shortly, are immediately addressed, investigated, and prosecuted, but that we take a step back and look at some of the, I think, structural needs for reform inside the DD waiver program. At this time, there are 3 defendants who stand accused and were arrested and taken into custody yesterday. Adelita Chacon is charged with abuse of a resident resulting in death, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit false imprisonment, and failure to report abuse and neglect. Patricia Hurtado is charged with neglect of a resident resulting in death, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit false imprisonment, and failure to report. And Luz Scott is charged with false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit false imprisonment. The story that unfolded after the investigation that was initiated by federal agents in El Paso and continued by state agents here in New Mexico is one where Ms. Chacon claims that there was a deterioration in the condition of Mary Morello while she was in her care and custody. What we know about Mary and her story before these events is that she was ambulatory. She was capable of cooking some of her own meals and had the ability to communicate in some fashion, but that she did require extensive care while she was in the DV program. We don't know, and we are still investigating, the extent to which third-party providers, and there were at least 4 third-party providers who administered various services and support and care in conjunction and coordination with the DV waiver program. But what we do know is that the primary coordinator of her care is a group called At Home Advocacy, AHA. And according to the records maintained by that organization, Mary was the subject of a home visit on January 25th of this year, which is just a little more than a month before she appeared in Mexico. She was scheduled for a second visit on February 27th, the day she showed up at the border. What we will continue to try and uncover and investigate is to what extent that home visit actually brought that third-party provider into direct contact with Mary, and what and how extensive that home consultation actually was. Because in reviewing her medical records, in reviewing the severity of the harm and trauma that was inflicted on her, it seems apparent that that home visit was inadequate, and we have very serious concerns about other patients that may be in a similar situation. What we can tell you is that part of our process in working with the Department of Health and our partners in other responsive agencies is to try and very quickly assess how many other individuals in the DV waiver program may in fact be suffering from abuse and neglect. And separate and apart from the investigation that we have undertaken and the prosecution that we have initiated, we will be looking for structural reforms to that program to better enable law enforcement and to better enable every member of this community and better protect the most vulnerable members of our community. I think from my perspective and the perspective I know of people who have led in this space, this is a wake-up call. We should be a wake-up call to each and every one of us. And I have a suspicion that before we are done, we will have several more instances of not only criminal referrals, but likely prosecutions resulting from abuse and neglect in this population. But it is difficult at this point to know how wide and how severe this problem truly goes. But before I get into the structural elements of some of the things that I think we need to discuss more broadly, I do want to focus and recognize on the law enforcement support that we received in the course of this investigation. And to carry that conversation forward, I'd like to introduce Special Agent in Charge, Raul Honda, of the Albuquerque Field Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
So, wake-up call. This is exactly what this is, and I'm not just saying a wake-up call to healthcare providers, to law enforcement. We know that this happens. It's a wake-up call to all of us as citizens of the state of New Mexico. Mary could easily have been our loved one. could have easily been my loved one. I know I've been through this process myself, and you expect, you demand that your loved one is taken care of in such a way that you will never worry about their well-being. The only thing you'll ever worry about is making sure that you're making time to go and see them. The last thing you ever hope for, the last thing you would ever want, is that for those individuals that were put there by the state or were provided by some healthcare provider would be the ones that were victimizing your loved ones. So that is the wake-up call to all of us. And why is the FBI involved in this? Well, first of all, because we have a great partnership with Mr. Torres' office. The governor, New Mexico State Police, CBP at the border, and every other agency that was involved, from Rio Rancho to the different parts of these individuals were actually arrested. We work as a community. We do everything together. Why? Because we want to make sure that if someone is doing this to someone that we care about, someone that you care about, that they pay for these crimes. The piece that we started looking at was based on, we had an individual that was from New Mexico, and now they're in El Paso, Texas. How did they get here? So when CBP contacted the FBI there in El Paso, the first thing they were trying to look at was this person kidnapped. And Mr. Torres described the condition that Mary was in. And obviously she could not tell the officer or even the medical professional at the hospital what had happened. But we knew, because we could see in the condition that she was in, that something terrible had happened. So we looked at it from a kidnapping perspective. We continue to look at it from that perspective as well. This investigation is not done. Investigation is far from being done, because we want to make sure that these individuals pay for what they have done to Mary Mileto. Don't forget that name. My hope is that there is no other Mary Miletos, but I'm not naive either. Because people will do whatever they can to exploit individuals, especially the ones that are most vulnerable in our society. So I will ask this to all of us, to all the citizens in the state of New Mexico, that if you think that your loved one might be being victimized, if you are in one of these facilities and you think that maybe something, they're not treating you like you think you should be treated, don't think about it, just contact law enforcement. If it's an emergency, call 911. If it's something long-term, you can always call us at 1-800 call FBI. And I also want to mention, you can always use the Elder Fraud Hotline, 833-FRAUD. If you contact us, we will use.
In addition to the support that we received from the FBI, we wouldn't have been able to complete this investigation without the support of the New Mexico State Police in terms of helping us gather evidence, search warrants, interview suspects. And so I'd like to introduce Deputy Chief Carolyn Wynn and invite her and thank her publicly for the support we received from the Mexico State.
Thank you. The violent abuse and neglect of Mary Mileto that resulted in her death is deeply disturbed and tragic. State Police worked on this investigation with the Attorney General's office, our federal partners, and our local partners, which led to the arrest of these 3 individuals. Home health care is trusted service, and it should provide comfort, support, and quality care to those in need. When incidents of abuse occur, it not only violates that trust, but also puts lives at risk and undermines the integrity of the entire care system. As state police, we take these investigations extremely seriously. Our objective is to ensure the safety and protection of all individuals within our communities, particularly those who may be more vulnerable and unable to protect themselves. In cases like this, we work closely with our local and federal partners, ensuring that those responsible for such heinous acts are brought to justice. Our department will continue to work with the Attorney General, the federal prosecutors and partners, and other state agencies, stakeholders to protect the well-being and rights of individuals in care. We encourage anyone who may have information related to this case or any concerns regarding abuse in care homes to come forward and report it. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Chief. We will, I know that there are probably a lot of questions about the details associated with this particular case and investigation. There's actually a 27-page affidavit filed in support of the arrest warrant that was executed yesterday, which contains, I think, a comprehensive overview and timeline of all of the steps that were taken in the multi-jurisdictional investigation. But I'd be happy to open it up at the end for additional questions that you may have, questions about the charge of prosecution. But at this time, I would like to take this opportunity to talk a little bit more about some of the structural issues that I think came to light in the course of this investigation. Right now, the DD waiver program is, in many respects, an example of I think, a very well-intentioned government program and system that is in need of substantially new resources, additional training, and additional parameters to make sure that every one of the enrolled program participants is adequately protected. First and foremost, one of the things that I have highlighted is the need for increased staffing and training for in-person inspections inside of these homes. I know that some of the members of the legislature, Representative Cates and Representative Thompson, who I'll ask to join me at the podium in just a second, have been advocating for some of these resources, but I think it's critically important that we take this opportunity to think through some of the things that we would like to see different in terms of how this program is administered. The second thing that I think needs to be on the table is regular health and safety inspections for all DD waiver participants. As it stands right now, we have a situation where we often rely on these third-party administrators, these corporations who are engaged in providing and facilitating care under contracts with the state to self-report whenever they discover an instance of abuse and neglect. I don't think that's an effective system. I think we need to have a separate, independent framework for inspections to be conducted by the state. I know that will be expensive. I know that's a difficult proposition. But I think Mary's case highlights the need for doing more to protect this population. Third, mandatory referrals to law enforcement for any substantiated case of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Fourth, raising public awareness for reporting potential abuse and neglect. We have an obligation to make sure that every member of our community understands where they can go to report allegations of abuse and neglect, share that information, and to be on the lookout. And we need to engage, I think, in a concerted campaign to educate the public about the need to look out for and protect these vulnerable members of our community. And the last element, which I think is really going to occupy a good deal of debate, I hope, in the upcoming legislative session, is an examination of new civil and criminal penalties for companies and providers who operate in this program. I commend the governor for terminating the contracts with the corporations who are associated with managing the care for Mary Malero. But right now, I don't think that we have sufficient criminal and civil penalties associated with providers that would permit or allow someone in Mary's condition to be abused, neglected, and exploited in this manner. And I think that changing that framework, adding additional penalties, would fundamentally reorient and refocus their efforts and hopefully encourage them to spend a good deal more making sure that people like Mary are better protected. AHA by itself collected nearly $250,000 in state taxpayer dollars in the nearly 3 years that Mary was in this home. And that was just one patient in just one home. And it seems to me that the taxpayers deserve more than Mary deserves. If these companies stand to benefit that much from government-supported programs like this, there should be a baseline expectation that they are held responsible and held accountable for what happens to patients in their care. I know that Representative Cates and Representative Thompson share my concern in this regard. They are much more knowledgeable than I am, having worked in this space for a good deal of time, and I know that they've been advocating to provide additional resources for members of this community for many, many years. And so with that, I'd like to step forward and talk a little bit more, not only about this case, but about the need for suspension.
Thank you. Excuse me. Being state representatives enables us to speak for the voiceless. It is our mission to provide robust and proactive resources to those who have unique disabilities. We stand by the Attorney General and anyone who strives to join us in creating systemic and effective changes to those who need extra support. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, I would invite Heather Benavides, who leads ARC of New Mexico, which is an organization that is dedicated to being advocates for people with disabilities, all people with disabilities across the state. Their organization has raised alarms about this population for a number of years, and I hope that their voice and their expertise will be included in what I think is a necessary reform to better protect this population. So with that, Heather.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. Heartbroken for the reason, but thank you nonetheless. I'm Heather Benavides, and I'm the CEO of the ARC of New Mexico, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues, Jacqueline Mader, she's our Director of Guardianship, and Denise Seelbach, she's our Representative Payee Manager. We were heartbroken to learn of the abuse and neglect of this protected individual. Their care, well-being, and dignity is the very reason our organization exists. And while the ARC is not involved with the investigation, we are grateful to Attorney General Torres and his team for holding these offenders accountable. And we look forward to working together to put safeguards in place to ensure that this tragedy never happens again. Thank you.
With that, I would take any questions that you may have about the status of the investigation or any of the proposed reforms that you've outlined today.
In the affidavit, it kind of hints at possible that she was.
So right now, we're still reviewing the investigative materials associated with that. I know it was included in the affidavit. So we haven't made a determination yet about whether or not that's an offense that we can identify as or confirm as a sexual assault, or if we would be able to prosecute and identify a perpetrator. It is, I will say that because Mary has passed and because of the condition that she was in, it would be extremely difficult to prove a case of that nature, even if we were able to substantiate the allegation that was contained in the affidavit. But we felt it necessary to include, to provide full context for the magistrate who had reviewed the application.
I know that your phone was also in the were there any abuse identified with him? Is he
part of the plan that was put in place by this office in coordination with local law enforcement was to notify the Department of Health to make sure that there was a smooth transition of his care. And so once the apprehension had been made at the home, he was transferred into qualified caregiver under the direction of the Department of Health. I don't have any information as to whether or not there's any evidence that he suffered from abuse and neglect. Certainly nothing of the extent that we saw with Mary.
Again, we'll remember when Mary was down the border, they told me it's terrible that happened. Why wasn't it arrested then or soon? Before today.
Right. So part of it is because you always wonder what is the situation when you have those individuals that were present. These three individuals that were there, with her in the back. They were saying completely things, right? They were trying to say we went there for this reason and that reason. So it's still part of the ongoing investigation, but at that point, it wasn't enough to say how did these injuries actually happen. The investigation itself is what it is that we do.
When it comes to some of these suggestions that you want to talk about and the disabilities, have you been in contact with the Department of Health? They said
So we have had, I've reached out to the governor's office We've also reached out to the Department of Health and had extensive conversation with them. They've been very cooperative and supportive of the investigation. We haven't gotten into the details of the reform proposals that we've set forth. But what I can tell you is that the folks at the Department of Health, I think, have a genuine concern for the people in this program. They simply don't have the manpower to conduct the kind of regular, routine, and detailed inspections that I think are necessary. And, you know, the bottom line, and I think that's why it's so important to have members of the legislature here, that comes down to money. It comes down to an investment. Last time I checked, I believe the department lists, 12 inspectors for a population of nearly 70,000 people. And as I understand it, they conduct something on the order of less than 10% of that population will get a random inspection at some point during the fiscal year. I don't think that's probably their preference. I just think it's a function of what they're capable of doing with current resources. And I think this criminal case should throw into sharp relief, you know, what the stakes are for people like Mary, for others like Mary. Because really what I worry about right now is who else is out there? What other members and participants in the DD waiver program are out there? I can tell you that at last count, there were 61 potential substantiated referrals for abuse and neglect. We have received so far 8 additional referrals from the department. But one of the things that we have to bear in mind is that although the governor ordered an in-person inspection of all 6,800 members of the DD waiver program, that was a one-time event. Do we have the staffing in place to do that going, you know, from this moment on, every 30 days, every 60 days, to make sure that every one of those individuals has been identified? Other states provide more technological support. They have apps for reporting abuse and neglect. They have a tiered structure for identifying the most at-risk members of the DD waiver program. And I think they have a system that, let's say, doesn't rely on contracted parties to self-report. Because that's one of the fundamental problems that I think has arisen in this case, is if you are the leader of a company or a manager in one of these companies, and you have a very lucrative contract that's at stake with the state of New Mexico, what real incentive do you have to self-report that someone in your system has been engaged in this kind of abuse and neglect? Probably not a lot, right? Because your concern is, if I report this, could it mean the end of the contract? And so what we need is a system that doesn't rely on those companies themselves to self-report, but independent, specially trained, adequately resourced state inspectors that have that kind of regular contact. Because again, as I said at the beginning, I think the DD waiver program, when properly resourced and properly supported with the right kind of health and safety inspections and protocols in place, is far better for people with disabilities, because we certainly don't want to go back to the horrific past where we had people with disabilities who were placed in institutions, right? Remember that that's where the DD waiver program came from. It's how do we get people out of institutions into the community and into their homes and into the homes of people that care for them and do love them. And I think many family members who are caring for people with disabilities, they rely on that government funding, and they do a great job because they care so much about their loved ones. It's are we doing enough to make sure that we provide additional supports for people like Mary? Because Mary, her mother passed away 3 years ago, and as we understand it, that's when things really got off track. And I don't think that's uncommon for people with disabilities, that they have a primary caregiver, usually a parent. And I'm familiar with some. I know some folks who have cared for a child with disabilities their whole lives. And they live with this fear of what happens to my child when I'm gone. And they shouldn't have that fear. They shouldn't have that fear, because in the back of their mind, what they're wondering is, what if he ends up in a home like this? Or what if she ends up in a home like this? And I'm not there to protect them. That's where the government steps in. That's where the state of New Mexico, the Department of Health, needs to step in and make sure that we've done this the right way.
Lori Green with Kennedy before. Along the same lines of reform, are there ways you guys are looking at to make it harder to become a caregiver within the developer program? Just so we don't see something.
Well, I think that's an aspect that I hope the legislature will look into. I can tell you that in the course of this investigation, we did discover that Ms. Chacon was denied an initial application to serve as a care provider because of a prior felony conviction. I think that happened in 2013, 2014. And for some reason that denial decision was subsequently reversed for some reason. We still don't have enough information about how that decision was made, but she was initially precluded from serving as a caregiver. And so I think it probably makes sense to take a very careful look at who is and is not eligible to apply.
You're mentioning increased staff and training and in-person inspections. Are you talking about oversight of case managers? Or are you talking about the people that go into the homes on a monthly basis? Because when you're talking about the word inspection, it leaves open the question of the individual's human rights being violated.
Yeah.
So what format are we talking about?
I think that's a conversation that needs to be taken up by the legislature, and I think you make a very good point. We have to respect the dignity and rights of people who have for far too long had their rights not respected by members of the government. But it's a balance. We have to find the right balance between respecting people's individual rights and their personal dignity, and also making sure that they're safe. And so it'll probably involve some combination of the two. What I can tell you definitively is I don't think 12 auditors at the Department of Health is adequate to properly safeguard the safety and security of nearly 7,000 people in the program. Now, to what extent they're allowed to have contact and in what format, I think that's something that should be determined by professionals in this space who have understood and worked in this space for a very long time, and I wouldn't presume to do that. But what I can tell you is 12 is not enough to protect 7,000 people. TJ.
I'm TJ Williams. Just want to double check something. 61 referrals. You mentioned 8 additional this time period.
Sean, do you have information?
So the 61 substantiated cases stemmed from the 6,800 in-person visits that were done by representatives from DOH, HSD, Aging and Long-Term Services between March 20th and April 21st when they actually finished. There's a process by which DOH, Incident Management Bureau, will review those cases, determine if they are in fact substantiated, and that is when the decision is made whether or not they'll refer those to the Attorney General's office. That was the 8 that the Attorney General was talking about. Those are the ones we have so far, of the 61.
So the 8 is into the 61.
Correct.
Cases. All right, and why do we know why you guys started doing that after the governor's conference?
Yeah, the in-person wellness visits were in response to the governor's press conference and mandate that those 3 departments of state government undertake those visits.
And my last question, sorry. You said that she was then, so she was denied it, right? And then she was able to get the program. When was she accepted?
So the actual felony conviction was back in 1999, I believe. She applied to be a caregiver through the Duty Waiver program in 2014. She was initially denied. She took advantage of their appellate process. She appealed, and the Department of Health overturned that and allowed her to be a caregiver. That's what we know at this point.
And is it the Department of Health or HSD that?
The Department of Health oversees the program, although the caregivers are funded through the Medicaid program, which is administered by HSD.
Thanks. The 61, so
eight are substantial, and the others may look into.
So we have received 8 referrals, and 8 additional referrals on top of the case that we just described here. But there are a total of 61 that are believed to be substantiated cases of abuse and neglect. They just haven't been transferred over from the initial evaluators inside the departments over to our agency. But we do expect, once they clear their final review, for them to be sent over for law enforcement.
Do we know how many of those, are any of those associated with at-home advocacy?
I don't have that information, but what I would tell you also is that because those are active investigations, we probably won't be able to get into the details of at least those 8 and any of the others until we get to a resolution.
And were any of those results?
No, not as far as I'm aware, but we still need to dig into that.
Can we have a cause of death for Mary's artificial cause of death?
At this point, it's my understanding the Office of the Medical Investigator in El Paso has not issued a formal finding on as to the cause of death. But we are making sure that the relevant reports have been provided to the Office of the Medical Investigator, in part because when you're determining manner and cause of death, it's critically important for pathologists to have a broad view, a contextual view. Because on their own, you may look at some of the injuries and not have a clear basis as to the causation. And so it's important for us to share that information with online. And once that final decision is made, we will obviously include it and provide a discovery to the rest.
I just want more. The number 5, let's say, what is available right now? What penalties could these companies possibly face in their space right now? What's available to
So based on my understanding that there is some mechanism in their contract that they could be subject to penalties, but that is built into the contract that they sign with the agency. It's not in statute. So there isn't, unlike other civil penalties that are clearly spelled out in statute and which we are empowered to enforce, let's say, for example, this violation of the Unfair Trade Practices Act is subject to $5,000 or some other act is subject to $10,000. There's no parallel mandatory civil penalty associated with a third-party provider that is supposed to be caring for an individual like this and has this kind of outcome that is then mandatory. So it is discretionary, but it is built into their plan. I don't think that's adequate, and I would like the legislature to look carefully at whether or not formalizing civil penalties in code is a better way to frame what the responsibilities are for these companies.
fraud and stuff like that? So,
Right, there are a number of civil penalties associated with violations of New Mexico statute, which when they are determined to be, after due process, determined to be in violation of whatever obligation they were supposed to meet, or failing to provide information, whatever the code may be, they are then subject to some defined penalty. And it's usually based on how many instances that violation has occurred, right? So the Unfair Trade Practices Act, it's $5,000 every time the company engages in a particular practice. The same kind of scheme could apply in this framework, so that if we have somebody like AHA that maybe has multiple clients in the system and we find multiple violations, they would be subject to multiple civil penalties.
How are you going to differentiate the penalties of companies and providers? Because you've got a different thing. You've got the providers who provide care, and then you've got case management agencies who are case managers and oversee and do the monthly visits. Are you going to try and put that all into one, or are you going to differentiate because it's totally different?
Yeah, again, this is going to be this is a broad overview of some of the things that need to be examined, but that's why we have legislative committees to dig into the details to figure out whether a particular person in this space should even be subject to penalties. Should they be the same penalties? What kind of conduct would trigger a violation and necessitate the payment of a civil penalty? And so that's for the legislature to put together and try to decide. My sense, though, is that it is inadequate to have the potential for a penalty to be built into a contract it should be clearly spelled out in the statute. Now, whether there are different levels of penalties, that's clearly something that I think the legislature will take up, and I hope they do in the next legislative session.
So at-home advocacy, were they a provider agency or case management agency?
It's my understanding
They're a provider agency who provided assistance with activities of daily living. Ms. Malero also had a case management company as well that was involved in the full spectrum of her care.
There were four companies in total that had their contracts canceled by the Department of Health as a result of this case.
One last question, this for me. How many more can different fellows taking care of people? And I assume you don't know, but there's a way. I find a list of people who do take care of these people, so we can find out how many more different fellows there are doing this.
TJ, unfortunately at this point I have no way of knowing how many people who might have been disqualified for any number of reasons appealed that disqualification and were subsequently reinstated by the department. It's certainly something that I know policymakers will be interested in looking at.
We'll take two more questions, one here and then one on the Zoom.
Yes, I just want to clarify a couple of things. Was the caregiver Chacon a family relative of the victim, and the victim living there with the caregiver's residence?
To the first question, it's my understanding that they were not relatives, that Ms. Chacon was not related to Mary, but she was being cared for in Ms. Chacon's home, along with Ms. Chacon's son, who also has disabilities. And so that was, they were both receiving care at the same time in the same place.
Then we've got a question on the Zoom from the Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General and Ms. Rodriguez for making this available. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. I'm Ken Ritter with the Associated Press. Perhaps the question was asked and answered previously and I missed it from afar. Do you have an idea how long the abuse in this case went on? And since I have one question, I'm going to tag it with this. Perhaps we could assume it began at the time that Chacon and Hurtado took care of Miss Mary, in which case you could tell us when that happened. And finally, how much were they paid through Medicare? Thank you.
So I don't think we have a definitive timeline. One of the things in terms of when the abuse and neglect started, how it started, and at what point it escalated. One of the things that we are likely to do in the course of presenting this case at trial is to secure the testimony of multiple medical experts to talk about the various injuries and how long it would take to a reasonable degree of medical certainty for these particular types of injuries to develop over time. What I can tell you is that based on some statements that we received there, within, I think, the month before she was taken to Mexico, she was actually spent several days in a bathtub in her own feces and urine for days at a time. And it is my sense that it accelerated pretty dramatically towards the end of her time in Ms. Chacon's home. But I can't say for certain. What I can also say is based on some of the injuries, there was a report that when Mary was still ambulatory or at least more mobile, that there was some kind of confrontation between the two of them. And Mr. Cohen made a statement that she had thrown a radio. A radio had been thrown between the two of them, and that she had actually received a laceration on her lip. This is Mary, and rather than taking Mary to a hospital, she was actually stitched, sutured with an at-home kit that was purchased, I believe, on Amazon. And so, those are the types of injuries and the conditions that she was found in. Now, was that a reference to what her life was like for the entirety of her time in that home? I don't know. My sense is not. It's my sense that the companies that had done some of those inspections probably would have seen, my hope was that they would have seen something earlier. but we will get into the details. I think one of the complicating factors in all this was the impact of the pandemic. It's my understanding that a good deal of the in-home visits were suspended or conducted by Zoom during the pandemic. And so I think that has had an impact and will continue to have an impact on our ability to develop a definitive timeline as to when and how her abuse progressed. And I don't have at this point a total of the, do you have a sense, Sean, of the money that was received by Chacon over the duration?
It was $236,000 since I believe around October of 2020, which is when, best we can tell, Ms. Molero was placed in the defendant Chacon's custody. So $236,000 from the Medicaid program in that period of time. I believe that also includes, in part, the care of her son. Needless to say, about $250,000 previously.
Does that include her Tado's pay too? Because I know she was also paid.
That does not include her Tado's pay, but she was also paid through Advocacy, I believe, for a period of time for caring for Ms. Molero. It does not include that.
That's 236. That's for.
That is for Ms. Chacon. That is how much money Ms. Chacon made for caring for the developmentally disabled folks in her care in a 3-year period of time.
It's also on February 27th that the late examination thing occurred. Maybe what? Why would they do that?
What I can tell you is that our office wasn't the lead investigative agency at that time. My sense is that it was in response to the medical professionals in the El Paso Medical Center, and the need to probably try and stabilize her. I would think that when she was first admitted, she was intubated, she suffered a cardiac arrest, and so there was probably some delay in conducting the kind of inspection that they needed to maybe identify some of those injuries. My assumption is, and it's an assumption, is that once she was stabilized, they were able to do a more comprehensive inspection and maybe notice what looked like injuries that were consistent with sexual assault. But again, that's speculation on my part, but we can certainly endeavor to try and find out that information. Yes, ma'am.
Who was involved in making the decision to turn off the light for you?
I don't know the answer to that. Okay. Thank you all for attending, and I appreciate your engagement in this really important issue, and I hope every member of our community understands just how serious this case is, not only from the perspective of finding justice for Mary, but making sure that we don't have any other individuals who are in this program who depend on the state for care and safety. We have to do more to protect them, and that's what we intend to do. Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.
Yes.